I saw horrors that not even time could erase. I remember exactly the moment when everything began to crumble inside me. It wasn't in the concentration camp. It wasn't in the photos of the bodies piled up, nor in the testimonies of the victims. It was in court, in the dock. That was when I saw the cold eyes of a man in a white coat, and I realized that he felt no guilt. Nothing. Just conviction. In that moment, I understood that evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it speaks softly, in scientific terms. It hides behind a clipboard, a stethoscope, a word in Latin. And when you realize it, it's already too late. I didn't come here to tell you another story about World War II. You've heard it before. Camps, soldiers, Hitler. No. What I came to tell you is what came after. What no one told you. I saw monsters being treated like geniuses. I saw victims silenced in the name of progress. I saw justice bent, corrupted, exported. And if you think the Nuremberg trials were the end of barbarity, it's because you never read between the lines. You never listened to what happened behind the scenes. You never saw what I saw. Because what really haunts me wasn't the crimes. It was what happened afterwards. And that's what you need to know. I was only called to translate. But I left carrying ghosts. I never thought that the language I learned from my grandfather would put me at the center of one of the darkest episodes in modern history. I had spoken German since I was little. At home, it was like keeping a forgotten inheritance alive, a language that my parents didn't use, but that my grandfather insisted on teaching. He had fled Germany back in the 1930s, well before the war. He never said why. He would only say that there was something rotten growing there. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Only much later, when I was an adult, did everything make sense. In 1946, I was working as a translation assistant for an American legal team. I received a direct call. A position had opened up on the support team for the Nuremberg trials. They needed someone who spoke German fluently and could handle technical documents. A month later, there I was, with a leather briefcase in my hands and my badge hanging around my neck, crossing the ruins of defeated Germany. Everything was grey. The streets, the clothes, the people's eyes. Nothing had color. It was as if the life had been drained from those cities. The only thing that kept running accurately was the clock of justice, or so they said. When I arrived at the courthouse, I realized that this was not just another trial. This was a stage. There were photographers, reporters, authorities from various countries. And behind the curtains, there were secrets. Lots of them. My job was simple, at least on paper, to translate medical documents and transcribe the interrogations of the defendants for the American lawyers. But from the first day, I felt that something was wrong. Something sick about the place. They handed me a box of files. On top was a label: Experimental Cases, Ravensbrück, Dachau, Auschwitz. When I opened it, I found clinical descriptions, black and white photographs, detailed reports. There were tables, graphs, codes, names. But everything had a cold, clinical veneer. If I didn't know better, I would have sworn it was some kind of scientific study. But then I read the first description. A Polish prisoner, female, 24 years old. Her right leg had been intentionally infected with bacteria. Then they cut pieces of it off, without anesthesia, to analyze the progress. The patient died on the 4th day. The report ended with satisfactory necrosis. Promising results. Promising. Promising. I felt like throwing up. But that was just the first one. There were dozens, hundreds, all recounting horrors in the same impersonal tone, as if they were testing laboratory animals. But they were people, human beings, some with names, others just with numbers tattooed on their arms. And I needed to translate that, word for word. At first, I thought it was an isolated aberration that few people knew about. But the more I read, the more I discovered. Military hospitals, universities, scientific institutes, all involved. It was like a network, a system. The Nazi doctors did not act alone. They were celebrated, applauded, awarded. The government itself encouraged scientific advances in the name of racial superiority. I was reading the clinical diary of hell. But what disturbed me most was seeing them in person. Yes, the defendants. They didn't look like monsters. No red eyes, no deformed faces. They were normal men. Some with a fragile appearance. Others with a certain intellectual charm. Well-ironed lab coats. Round glasses. Calm voices. When they responded to the accusations, it was as if they were explaining an appendectomy. I will never forget Dr. Sivas. When asked if he was aware that his experiments were killing the prisoners, he replied, "It was a necessary price for the advancement of science." A price. Necessary. Those words echoed in my mind for weeks. And then came Dr. Gebhardt, a name I only knew from the archives. He was responsible for experiments with gangrene. He tested different forms of amputation and treatments that consisted of leaving the wounds open and full of maggots. In court, he was calm. He spoke with a certain pride of his medical contributions. But there was something even more disturbing. Some members of the audience admired him. I saw American officers taking careful notes of his speeches. They whispered among themselves. They discussed the methods. And that was when I understood. They weren't there just to condemn. They were recruiting. As the days went by, my naivety was being torn from me like living skin. I began to realize that it wasn't justice they were looking for. It was information, technology, knowledge. And those doctors, with their calm faces and their bloody charts, had a lot to offer. In my hotel room at night, I could barely sleep. I had nightmares about the descriptions I had translated. I saw bodies on stretchers, twin babies sewn together at the shoulders, women with rotting limbs, men frozen alive in tanks of ice water. And then, I saw the doctors' faces smiling, applauded, promoted. I walked into that courtroom thinking I was going to help convict monsters. But I left with another certainty: the monsters, somehow, were winning. The silence of the victims, before the trial. There was a room next to the courtroom. Small, cold, windowless. That was where the survivors waited before testifying. I would go there sometimes, to hand over documents or receive a transcript. And every time I went in, the air changed. It got heavy, thick, as if pain permeated the walls. They didn't talk much. Maybe because they didn't know what else to say. Or maybe because they knew that no one really wanted to hear it. I remember a woman. Thin, translucent skin, shaved hair. I don't know her name. I don't even know if she was still alive inside. She sat in a corner, staring at the floor. I was told she had been subjected to multiple gynecological experiments, forced sterilizations, induced infections, internal dissections. She was only 19 at the time of the experiments. When her name was called, she didn't get up. A doctor from the commission had to help her walk to the courtroom. And when she got there, her voice wouldn't come out. She opened her mouth. She tried. But all she could do was cry silently. The defense used this against her. They said her memory was compromised. That her testimony was unreliable. But I saw her eyes. And in them, there was a truth that no official record would ever record. I also saw a man. A gypsy. He couldn't have been more than 30 years old, but his body looked like that of a sick old man. He spoke with difficulty, spitting out words in German, trying to tell how they had arrested his entire family. How he and his brother had been taken for endurance tests, high-altitude experiments, exposure to poisons, oxygen deprivation. His brother hadn't survived. The audience listened in silence, as if he were just another piece of technical data. The defendant doctors looked at him with disdain. One of them, I remember well, smiled, and whispered something to his colleague next to him. They laughed. They laughed. At the pain of a man who had buried his brother with his own hands, behind the medical barracks, using a piece of wood as a shovel. And no one reacted. Not the judge. Not the soldiers. Not the lawyers. I wanted to scream. But I held myself back. I was just a translator. I just read. I transcribed. I observed. Sometimes I wonder if this makes me an accomplice. There was a pattern. The survivors were placed at quieter times of the day, when the press had already left. Their statements were cut for technical reasons. Their stories were summarized in the records as emotional statements without scientific proof. But how do you prove pain that no one wants to feel? How do you measure the trauma of someone who was mutilated in the name of medicine? I began to notice that some testimonies simply disappeared from the files. Others were rewritten. Some victims' names didn't even appear in the official records. And deep down, there was a fear. A terrible fear hanging over all of them. The fear of being forgotten again. Because they had been forgotten before, when they were in the camps. They screamed and no one listened. Now, even with microphones, cameras, documents, they were still being silenced. A Hungarian lady told me something that has never left my mind. They used us as a laboratory, and now, they want to erase even that. She looked me in the eyes, and I felt small. An accomplice, perhaps. Dirty. I remember one afternoon, after a particularly disturbing testimony, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried. Alone. Sitting on the cold marble floor. My soul felt like heavy. I just thought, why doesn't anyone react? But I soon learned. It wasn't just about justice. It was about politics, agreements, science, and, above all, convenience. The victims had no strategic value. They couldn't offer formulas, knowledge, or data. They only had scars. And pain. And pain is disposable. A few days later, a survivor tried to hang herself in the courthouse bathroom. She used her own scarf. She didn't succeed. But no one called her to testify anymore. She disappeared from the records, as if she had never existed. It was at that moment that I started keeping hidden copies. I wrote on small pieces of paper. I made notes. I saved fragments of stories. Because I knew, someone had to remember. Someone had to tell this one day. Even if it was too late. Even if no one else wanted to hear it. The first impact with secret files. They handed me a grey box, locked with 2 leather straps. Heavy. It smelled of mold and scrap metal, as if it had been stored in a basement for too long. One of the American colonels who headed the legal team looked me in the eye before handing it to me and simply said, "You'll want to read this slowly, and with a strong stomach." I didn't understand right away. I had already read dozens of disturbing reports in the previous days. Photos of dead bodies, descriptions of torture, broken testimonies. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. But I was wrong. When I opened the box, I found a dossier marked with a red seal, Geheim, Klassifiziert, Confidential, Classified. And below, in small, cold letters, Experimental Reports, SS Hygiene Institute, Advanced Biomedical Section. The first file I pulled out looked harmless. Beige cover, no title, just a code number. I opened it and found graphs, charts, precise measurements, all in technical German. For a moment I thought I was reading something about metabolism, or perhaps physical endurance tests. But then I found the first photo. It was of a young man, nude from the waist up. His skin was blackened in several areas, as if he had been burned with acid or subjected to intense radiation. His eyes were open but dull. Dead. Just below the image it read, Patient 17B, undergoing white phosphorus explosion simulation. Objective: to measure the limits of epithelial regeneration in Aryan and non-Aryan tissue. Explosion simulation. Epithelial regeneration. Aryan and non-Aryan tissue. I closed the folder. I took a deep breath. But curiosity, or perhaps the need to understand, overcame me. I kept reading. I found reports on hypothermia tests, prisoners submerged in water at 4 degrees Celsius for hours, until their heartbeats stopped. Some were, according to the doctors, reactivated with boiling baths. Others died. The cause of death was precisely noted: cardiovascular collapse due to multiple system failure. Further on, gynecological reports, chemical sterilizations, forced incisions in the uterus, intrauterine injections of colloidal silver. Women aged 16, 17, tested in series. Some pregnant women. And then, a study with twins. A pair of brothers, boys, 7 years old, both subjected to cross-transfusions of blood, injections with specific bacteria, and, at the end, dissected simultaneously for comparative analysis of organic damage. It wasn't fiction. It wasn't a horror film. It was medicine. Nazi medicine. And I read it all. I translated it. It was clean. He coded it so the lawyers could use it in their arguments. But with every word, something inside me was dying. One day, I found a handwritten note, stuck to the end of one of the reports. Results below expectations. Samples not viable due to premature deterioration of the body. It is recommended to repeat the experiment with a younger control group. Younger control group. We're talking about children. Living bodies. And the author of the note. A man I saw in court a few weeks later. In a suit. Crossing his legs as he calmly spoke about medical ethics and the need for clinical trials in controlled environments. They spoke with pride. As if they had accomplished great things. As if they had discovered secrets of biology. And technically, maybe they had. But at what cost? I began to realize that these files were not being used just to incriminate them. Some American officials treated them like gold. I saw Air Force engineers analyzing data from altitude tests. I saw civilian scientists photographing graphs of hypothermia. They said among themselves that such studies would be impossible to replicate legally. Yes, legally. But there they were. Ready, cruel, and available. Science was on its knees before the horror. And I, in that moment, felt as if I were at the center of a silent agreement between the living and the dead, where the screams of the victims were muffled by the numbers, where the agony became statistics. I kept a copy of one of the reports with me. I hid it inside the lining of my briefcase, not for revenge, nor for rebellion, but for fear. Fear that all of it would be buried, that the files would disappear. That history would turn into a convenient lie. That night, I looked out my bedroom window. There was snow covering the ruins of the city, a heavy silence. And I asked myself, how many more know about this? How many are hiding it? And the scariest thing, how many are agreeing? Because the Nazi doctors committed atrocities. But it was those who came after, the ones who looked, read, and used it, who truly terrified me. I entered that courtroom thinking that science was light. I left there knowing that, without a soul, it is just a sharp blade in the wrong hands. First contact with one of the Nazi doctors at the trial. I thought I knew what evil was. I thought I had seen him before in the photographs of the camps, in the medical reports I had translated, in the faces of the victims who could barely speak in court. But evil, I discovered, he had another face. A calm face. A face that smiled. And I saw him for the first time when I was asked to deliver a file to the interrogation block. It was unusual for me to go there. My job was behind the scenes, reading, translating, typing, delivering. But that day, I was told they needed someone who spoke German fluently and was discreet. Discreet. A word that, in that environment, carried much more than silence. It was like a pact. Something that was accepted, and not discussed. I climbed the stone steps of the security block and was led by a guard into a small room with double doors. Inside, a man was sitting at a table, alone. Handcuffs on his wrists, attached by a chain to the iron chair. He looked up as I entered, and smiled. A warm, almost friendly smile. It was Dr. Waldemar Hoven, an SS doctor, responsible for hundreds of murders by lethal injection at the Buchenwald camp, and also for experiments with infectious diseases and forced sterilizations. I knew who he was. He had translated documents with his signature, surgical reports with phrases like intracardiac administration of phenol, death immediate, result satisfactory. He was known for walking between the barracks as if he were a gardener, deciding who would live and who would die. And there he was, looking at me as if we were co-workers. "You speak German, don't you?" he asked, his voice calm and polite. I nodded, without saying anything. "I'm glad. My English is terrible." He laughed. A light laugh. As if we were in a waiting room, waiting for the coffee to arrive. I handed the folder to the officer in the room, but I stayed there for a few moments, watching. The doctor seemed comfortable, almost bored. "You know," he said, leafing through some papers, "medicine is not what it says in the books. It takes courage. No one advances without sacrifice." Courage. Sacrifice. Was that what he thought he had done? I forced myself to keep my face neutral, but inside, something was burning. The folder I had just handed him contained testimonies from survivors who had seen him inject gasoline into the hearts of prisoners. One of them, a young French communist, had agonized for more than 10 minutes before dying. Waldemar, according to the witnesses, had simply watched. He had taken notes. And at the end he would say, the result was below expectations. The dose was small. And now he was talking about courage? I wanted to ask him if he could sleep at night. If he remembered the faces. If any of them came back to him in his dreams. But he anticipated me. As if he could read my thoughts. "You think I'm a monster, don't you?" My throat tightened. He was smiling, but his eyes hardened. "Everyone does. But tell me, when a soldier kills on the battlefield, he's a hero. When I kill with a syringe, am I a criminal?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. It was like talking to a polished wall of distorted rationality. He didn't see himself as guilty, or as remorseful. He saw himself as necessary. The world is made by those who have the stomach. You'll understand that one day. I left the room with sweaty hands. The hallway seemed narrower, the air thicker. My chest felt heavy as if I'd been punched. But that wasn't the worst time. A few days later, I met Herta Oberhuser, the only woman among the Nazi doctors tried at Nuremberg. She had worked at the Ravensbrück camp, specializing in experiments on female prisoners, especially surgical mutilations and the application of infectious substances directly into open wounds. When she entered the courtroom, I could tell that many in the audience could not believe that this woman, with her soft features and ordinary appearance, had done what the document said. She looked frail, polite. She wore her hair tied back in a bun. Elegant, soberly dressed. When asked about the experiments, she responded with disconcerting naturalness. We were looking for alternatives to combat infections on the battlefield. She spoke like a responsible doctor, a researcher, except that the guinea pigs were tied-up women, screaming in pain while their legs were opened with a scalpel without anesthesia. Some had their muscles extracted for analysis. Others received substances that caused necrosis, requiring repeated amputations. And when the prosecutor asked if she regretted it, her answer was a long silence, followed by a slight shrug. I was just following orders. That's when I understood. Evil is not always revealed with screams or violence. True evil is that which believes it is doing good. And these people, these doctors, believed they were saving the world. That the suffering of their inferior was an acceptable path to achieving progress for humanity. They were not crazy. They were too rational. And perhaps that is what scares me the most to this day. Because when logic overcomes compassion, anything can be justified. Everything. The shock of the courtroom, when science becomes torture. The first time I entered the main courtroom as an observer, I felt small. The ceiling was too high, the walls too heavy, and the silence, heavy as a storm about to break. I was there to help translate some technical passages that would be used during the hearing that day. But what I witnessed was more than just a trial. It was a collapse. Of morality. Of truth. Of humanity. That morning, the prosecutor was preparing to present a series of evidence about the experiments carried out at Dachau and Ravensbrück. The chairs were filled with military personnel, reporters, lawyers, and a few surviving victims. The main defendant that day was Dr. Sigmund Rascher. It was a name I already knew. I had translated many of his reports. But hearing the descriptions read aloud, with the photos projected in absolute silence, was something else. Rascher had conducted decompression experiments on living prisoners. He simulated what would happen to fighter pilots if they were exposed to extreme altitudes without protection. To do this, he used a low-pressure chamber. Inside, men were stripped naked and had their heart rates monitored as their lungs collapsed. Most died within minutes, some within seconds, and according to the documents, Rascher watched it all through a small window and took notes. Cold, methodical, scientific. That day, the prosecution projected a series of graphs taken from his reports. Colored lines representing body temperature, blood pressure, time until loss of consciousness. The audience watched the curves rise and fall, as if it were a lecture. And then the prosecutor paused and said, "These lines represent the slow death of a man. And this," he pointed to one of the images, "is his face moments before the end." The photograph appeared. It was a prisoner with his eyes rolled back, foam coming out of his mouth, his body strapped to leather straps inside the chamber. A murmur cut through the air. Someone swallowed hard. Another looked away. But the most disturbing was Rascher. He showed no regret, no fear, no shame. When the image appeared, he tilted his head slightly to the side, as if he were analyzing his own work. "It was necessary," he said, when asked if he knew he was killing. The Luftwaffe needed answers. Our soldiers were dying on high-altitude missions. Someone had to do the tests. Someone had to do it. That justification chilled me to the bone. Next, documents were presented about the freezing tests. Prisoners were placed in tanks of ice. They remained there until their heartbeats stopped. Then they were taken out and subjected to rapid rewarming using various methods. Hot water, hot breaths on their faces, even forced sexual intercourse with SS women, as a natural warming method. All of this was in the files. All of this was presented in court. The prosecution read the reports. They showed the photos, the names, the signatures of the doctors. And all the while, the accused took notes. They took notes. As if they were attending a medical conference. As if these deaths were not executions, but merely experimental failures. It was like living a waking nightmare. At one point, one of the defense attorneys stood up and said firmly, "These experiments were conducted with superior authorization, within a war context. They are harsh methods, yes, but they were also practiced, in other forms, by the Allies. What distinguishes a scientific advance from a war crime?" No one answered. Because the question, however cynical it was also a trap. Provocation. A dirty mirror. There was tension in the air. I could feel it on my back, like static electricity. Because, deep down, some of the people there were asking themselves exactly that. Much of the data extracted from those experiments was being copied, stored, studied. They were judging, but they were also learning. This paradox was eating away at me. I looked at the documents, with official letterhead, impeccable graphs, clinical language, and felt as if I were in the presence of a science without a soul. A science where human life was just an input, a number, a variable. At another time, Dr. Herta Oberhuser was called to hear reports on her experiments. Reports of young women, mutilated, stitched, infected. She remained impassive. She moved her fingers slowly. She stared at the ceiling. When asked why she performed certain procedures, she answered, "Because it was necessary to know how the female body reacts to mixed infections. Because it was necessary to know." Always that phrase. Like a mantra of rationalized barbarity. At the end of that session, I walked alone through the halls of the courthouse. The world seemed to spin more slowly. I could hear the voices echoing off the walls. The questions. The answers. The numbers. I began to question everything I knew about progress. About morality. About the limits of science. I began to understand that the line between doctor and executioner, between research and torture, was much thinner than what we are taught in books. And that, in that courtroom, that line had already been crossed a long time ago. The invisible victims and the world's contempt. It didn't happen overnight. The erasure was slow, silent, like a cut that starts small but bleeds until you realize you're dying inside. At the beginning of the trials, the victims still had some space. They were called to testify, their stories were written down, their tears were photographed. Some newspapers even published their stories with a certain respect, almost as a reverence for the pain they carried. But that didn't last long. Soon, the spotlight turned to the defendants, to the doctors, to the lawyers, to the technical scandals, the legal debates, the procedural strategies. The victims were left in the shadows. I remember sitting next to a skeletal woman, a Ravensbrück survivor. She had been summoned as a witness, but her appearance had been postponed 4 times. No one had warned her. No one had looked her in the eye. She just waited, hours, days, in the cold hallway, holding a folder with documents that she herself could no longer read. She had lost part of her vision during the experiments. She asked me, in a weary whisper, "Will they still listen to me?" And I lied. I said yes. I said they were waiting for the right moment. But I knew. They had already decided that her voice was a nuisance. That her story didn't fit the neat script they were trying to put together. She didn't come back the next day. And no one noticed her absence. I saw it happen so many times I lost count. Survivors ignored in the hallways, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs while defendants were fed lukewarm meals and attended to by personal doctors. I saw a woman, an Austrian Jew, thrown out of the waiting room because, according to an officer, her crying was disturbing the staff. She had been used as a guinea pig in chemical sterilization tests. She had been only 13 when the experiments began. Now an adult, her body was damaged, her soul was in ruins, and no one wanted to hear her cry. Disturbing. That was the word. Real pain. Disturbing too much. The reports on the experiments read like scientific protocols. The lawyers cited clinical terms, distant, sterile. But when a victim opened her mouth to tell how she begged for help while being cut alive, or how she was tied naked to a gurney for 3 days under ice, faces turned. Pens stopped. The embarrassment was almost palpable, as if, somehow, their screams ruined the aesthetics of the trial. It was easier to listen to the doctors. They spoke calmly, without tears. Logically, the pain got in the way of the narrative. There was also a subtle but constant contempt. The survivors did not receive adequate care. Many were malnourished, sick, disoriented. Some did not have appropriate clothing for the Nuremberg cold. They slept in improvised shelters or in cheap hotels, paid for with donations from civil entities. Meanwhile, the accused were in heated cells. They received visitors. They had access to books. Some even played chess. I saw a guard hand an extra blanket to a doctor convicted of vivisection. That same day, I saw a witness, a limping woman with a withered arm, being ignored as she shivered in the anteroom. The logic was simple. The doctors were useful. The victims were not. I started to keep track of their names. I wrote down their stories on sheets of paper. Loose, which I hid deep in my briefcase. No one told me to do it. But I felt that if I didn't record it, they would disappear. Again. One of them, named Lena, I remember it like it was yesterday, told me, "In the war, they called us animals. Now, we are noise. Distortion. An obstacle in their path." She said this looking out the window, her forehead pressed against the glass, while the snow fell outside. The city, in ruins, seemed to reflect exactly what she felt inside. And she was right. Little by little, the newspapers began to ignore the victims' testimonies. The reports were cut from the speeches. Behind the scenes, I heard officials saying that no one wanted to hear stories of suffering anymore. That the public was already emotionally saturated. But the truth was crueler. It was more convenient to keep the focus on the doctors, on the data, on the formulas. How the knowledge generated by so much blood could now be useful, applicable, reused. The victims got in the way of this new purpose. In one of the last sessions I attended, a man who had lost his 2 children in Auschwitz both used in controlled starvation experiments, tried to read a letter written by his wife before she died. The judge interrupted. He said that the content was irrelevant to the trial. Irrelevant. The death of 2 children. The pain of a mother. A final lament written by hand. Irrelevant. That was when I understood. In that court, they were not just judging the past. They were redesigning the future. And in it, there was no room for the victims. The manipulation of trials. Justice begins to rot. The first time I noticed that something was wrong, really, was by chance. I had been called to review a translation of a report that, until then, had been considered confidential. An 18-page file describing hypothermia experiments conducted by SS doctors at Dachau. Nothing I hadn't already read, graphs, cold exposure times, hourly mortality. All painfully precise. But when I reread the translated document days later, for the trial, something was missing. A line. It was a sentence that had been in the original version. Results were communicated to the German Air Force Medical Institute with recommendation for technical exchange. Simple, direct, and incriminating. Because it not only confirmed that the experiments were known to higher military authorities, but also that there was an intention to share the results with other powers. The line was gone. I asked the officer in charge. He replied curtly. The sentence was considered irrelevant to the prosecution's arguments. It causes unnecessary noise. Noise. That's what they called anything that threatened the political balance of the trial. Behind the scenes, the courtroom was no longer a real place. It was becoming a stage. Each witness was measured, each sentence timed, each document filtered. Not by what they said, but by what was convenient to say. I began to suspect. And the more I watched, the more I saw the strings being pulled by invisible hands. I began to notice that some Nazi doctors, especially those with more advanced scientific training, were receiving different treatment. More visits. More time with their lawyers. Even different food. At first I thought it was paranoia. That maybe I was seeing ghosts where there was only bureaucracy. But then a French translator took me aside, during a coffee break. He was pale. He was shaking a little. Did you know that they're removing evidence from the archives? Entire reports have disappeared from the archives wing. And there are people from the United States talking to the doctors in the cells. At night. In secret. I didn't want to believe it. But he continued. They want the data. The methods. The formulas. Everything. And they're willing to suppress whatever is necessary. That night, I didn't sleep. I rummaged through the documents I had hidden, my personal notes, and realized that some of the most brutal reports, the ones dealing with extreme pain resistance, for example, had disappeared from the official versions. Gone. As if they had never existed. A few days later, I overheard a muffled conversation between 2 American officers in the inner courtyard. One of them said, "This Rasher guy may be a bastard, but the decompression data he generated is better than anything we have so far." The other replied, "We need to think about what is more useful, punishing the past, or preparing for the future." That's when I realized, the trial was no longer about justice. It was about utility. About what could be salvaged from the ashes of the Reich to feed the interests of the victorious powers. And doctors, torturers in white coats, were seen as a rare commodity. Valuable. I saw this firsthand in the case of Dr. Hubertus Strughold, a scientist involved in low-pressure, freezing studies using prisoners. He never came to trial. Do you know why? Because the United States recruited him. They took him to their territory. He taught. He published articles. He was honored. A war criminal, renamed the father of American aerospace medicine. And he wasn't the only one. Many others were taken, hidden, reused, and the victims, forgotten, reduced to footnotes, their screams erased, their bodies buried under a thick layer of military, scientific, and political interests. I began to realize that the sentences of the Nazi doctors were being traded like merchandise. One of them, accused of multiple vivisections, had his sentence commuted to partial imprisonment. Another, involved in lethal gas tests, was acquitted for lack of direct evidence, despite dozens of testimonies. It was as if there were two parallel realities in the courtroom. The official one, with her robes, her speeches, her rhetoric, and the real one, where deals were made behind closed doors, where monsters were given new names and new functions, and where justice was just a shadow used to hide the bargain. At that point, I asked myself, why continue? Why continue translating, recording, cataloguing, if everything was being shaped to favor the executioners? The answer came to me one afternoon, sitting in the back of the room, watching a victim, a middle-aged woman, trying to describe how her son had been taken from her arms during a medical selection. She was shaking so much that she could barely stand. The judge cut her testimony short. He said it was not relevant to the case at hand. But before leaving, she looked back. She looked directly at me, and said, almost in a whisper, "Don't let them rewrite everything." It was at that moment that I understood that my role there was no longer institutional. It was testimonial. It was no longer about helping the lawyers. It was about saving, recording, keeping alive the truth that the world was already beginning to forget. Because the worst pain was not what those doctors had done. It was what they did with the silence afterwards. Operation Paperclip, when the monster gets a new badge. I was not part of military intelligence. I was not an investigator, nor a reporter. But sometimes the truth creeps up on you. It crawls under doors, slips through the cracks in documents. And when you realize it, you can no longer unsee it. It was on a rainy night in March 1947 that everything changed. One of the interns in the copy department left a folder on my desk by mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake, I still wonder to this day. It was a black folder, marked only with a protocol number and the word, Confidential, Level 3. I opened it. Inside was a list of names. Names I already knew. Names I had read over and over again in the trials. Doctors, scientists, engineers, all with Nazi histories. All implicated in war crimes. But there, next to each name, was something that made me freeze. Status: recruited. Location: Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. Status: transferred. Project: NASA. Status: protected. Sector: biological intelligence. I stopped breathing for a moment, because I understood what this was. That folder wasn't an investigation. It was a catalogue. A catalogue of monsters being repurposed. The list was part of something bigger, an operation called Paperclip, which until then I had only heard whispers of among the older employees. They said it was a kind of resume cleansing promoted by the Americans, to import the rice brains before they fell into Soviet hands. But now, I saw it with my own eyes. The United States was saving war criminals, erasing their records, creating new identities, and offering them positions in prestigious institutions. The same science that had murdered children, frozen prisoners alive, injected chemicals into still-beating human hearts, was now called strategic advancement. It was a betrayal of the dead, of justice, of memory. I remember one specific name, Dr. Kurt Blohm, Deputy Director of the Third Reich's Biological Warfare Division. He had been accused of infecting prisoners with bubonic plague, typhus, and anthrax. At Nuremberg, he denied everything, but the documents said otherwise. I had translated them. And yet, there it was, recruited, Operation Paperclip. Project, Bacteriological Warfare Research, Fort Detrick, Maryland. I felt sick. I ran to the bathroom and threw up everything I had eaten. I washed my face. I looked in the mirror, but I didn't recognize myself. What I saw in the trials, what I experienced alongside the victims, the witnesses, the unburied dead, everything was being erased with rubber stamps. It was as if lime had been thrown over a field of corpses. The next day, I tried to confront one of the coordinators of the Central Archive. I said that there were inconsistencies, that criminals were being protected. He just stared at me with a blank stare and said, "Do you want to even get involved in this?" It was a threat, but it was also true, because the entire system was already compromised. It was no longer a question of justice or ethics. It was geopolitics. It was the Cold War. It was, we need them before the Russians take them. And anyone who disagreed was disposable. I started investigating on my own. I combed through shipping lists, immigration records. I saw names being changed. Joseph Mengele started using other pseudonyms. Other doctors who should have been arrested, tried, hanged, were living with their families in quiet neighborhoods in America. Some were even giving lectures. One of them was honored at a university with a bronze plaque. Pioneer of aerospace research. I knew that their hands had already opened a child's chest, without anesthesia. I began to have nightmares. I dreamed of operating rooms covered in blood, and applause in the background. I dreamed of smiling doctors in clean lab coats as bodies disappeared beneath flags. And the worst part, I couldn't tell anyone. If I did, I would lose my job. Maybe my freedom. Maybe more. So I did what I could. I hid it. I wrote it down. I copied it. I created my own secret archive. A personal memorial of everything they knew and wanted to hide. Every page I kept was an attempt to preserve the truth. Every name, every date, every fragment of horror was a reminder that even when the world decides to forget, someone still remembers. Because if they don't remember, then they win. Not just the doctors. Not just the generals. But the logic behind it all. The idea that progress justifies torture, that science is above all else. Morality, that the ends can erase the means. I saw hell disguise itself as a laboratory. And now, I saw this hell being exported to the new world, with badges, salaries, and pats on the back. The trial had been just a facade. True justice? It was suffocated, page by page, in the dead of night. The price of silence, when the truth poisons you from the inside. I began to hear footsteps where there was no one. Doors creaking in the middle of the night. Muffled voices behind walls that I knew too well to believe there was anyone there. I woke up sweating, with the sheets soaked, my heart pounding as if I had run miles inside my own room. That was how I knew the truth was starting to kill me. Not all at once, but little by little, like a silent poison that seeps through the soul. On the outside, I was still the same discreet employee, the translator, the archivist, the invisible assistant. On the inside, I was a battlefield, memories and documents colliding with each other, forming a storm that didn't let me breathe. Everything began to fragment. Time, faces, names. I could no longer talk to anyone without suspicion. I could no longer trust any official document. Every page that passed through my hands carried the smell of lies. Lies, printed with new ink on old corpses. I had become a capsule of secrets, a walking grave, and that began to eat away at me. I remember one night when I walked to the center of Nuremberg alone. It was winter. The streets were almost deserted. The empty storefronts, like dead eyes. The buildings still bore the marks of war. Broken windows, shrapnel buried in the sidewalks, the silence that only exists where death has passed first. I sat on a bench in a square, where, years before, Nazi speeches had echoed, and closed my eyes. The icy wind cut my skin, but what really hurt was inside. A pain that doesn't bleed, but it suffocates. In my head, the faces came in sequence. The victims I interviewed. The ones I cried in silence over. The ones who didn't even get to testify because they died before. The ones who were ignored. And the other faces, those of the doctors. The ones who were tried. The ones who escaped. The ones who now walked freely through American laboratories, winning medals, publishing articles, being called geniuses. I wanted to scream. To get up and go to the front of the American military headquarters and burn all the files that hid the truth. But I knew. No one would listen. Or worse, they would listen, but they wouldn't care. Because the truth, there, was only useful if it was useful. If it could be converted into rockets, weapons, technology. Pain didn't bring profit. I started to put everything in boxes. Diaries. Copies of reports. Handwritten notes. I hid them in the back of the closet, among old clothes and books that no one had read. I opened them. Sometimes, I would just take them out to reread them. Like someone touching scars to remember they are still there. My health began to decline. I had chronic insomnia. The doctor prescribed me tranquilizers. He said it was just post-war stress. He had no idea what was eating away at me inside. There was one time, and I never told anyone this, that I almost threw everything away. The boxes, the papers, the memories. I couldn't stand living among the dead any longer. But then, that same night, I opened one of the documents. It was a testimony from a Polish survivor, a young man who had lost his entire family in Buchenwald. He described how he pretended to be dead, covered in blood and bodies, to escape the freezing experiments. At the end of the text, he had written something by hand. If anyone ever finds this, please don't let my pain become a statistic. I closed my eyes. I held the paper in both hands. And I decided I would never throw this away. But there was a bigger problem. What to do with all that? Publish it? Give it to the press? What if they silenced me? What if they disappeared with me, like they had with so many other documents? Yes, because at that time, the shadows were still alive. One time, leaving the court, I noticed a man following me. Elegant, dark hat, glasses. He pretended to read the newspaper, but he walked at the same pace as me. He turned the same corner. He stopped when I stopped. He started walking again when I started walking again. My blood ran cold. I went into a cafe. I pretended to be looking for something. I waited. When I came out, he was gone. Coincidence? Maybe. But at that moment, I realized that the truth has a cost, and that sometimes knowing too much is an invitation to forget. I started leaving letters ready. Handwritten wills. Copies of documents sent to trusted friends, under the pretext of historical revisions. I prepared myself like someone preparing for death. Because living with this burden is dying a little each day. You start to forget what it's like to laugh, what it's like to sleep in peace, what it's like to hug someone without imagining the pain they might be hiding. You close yourself off. You turn to stone. Cold on the outside, boiling on the inside. And yet, I kept going. Because I knew that if I stopped, all of this would disappear. And no one would tell the real story anymore. Not the one in the books, but the one between the lines of the erased reports, in the eyes of the victims who were not heard, in the stained documents that smelled of dried blood. If I stopped, the horror would be rewritten as glory. And I could not allow that. My secret court, the trial that never happened. It was when I accepted that there was no more justice possible, that I began to create it on my own. Not for the courts, not for the newspapers, but for myself, for the dead, for those who screamed and were not heard. The trial taking place in front of the cameras was a farce, a theater of convenience, where the masks of the victors hid the appetite of the accomplices. But I still had the names, the dates, the documents that should never have survived. So I started organizing. At first it was just one box, then 2, 3, folders coded with made-up letters, smuggled copies, handwritten testimonies, scratched photographs, everything that no one wanted to see. I silently called it the Court of Silence. It was the only place where the victims could still speak. Hill by hill, I piled up the evidence that the world ignored. There was no gown, no gavel, but there were voices, many voices. The voice of a 19-year-old Czech girl, sewn alive to test her resistance to infection. That of a Polish priest, left naked in an experimental gas chamber, where he died trying to pray. That of a green-eyed child who was holding a rabbit-shaped pencil when she was taken to be sterilized with radiation. Yes, I saved the drawing too. A folded sheet of paper, with childish lines, stained with something that might have been blood. It was a trial without a hearing, without a sentence, but with a truth clearer than any stamped document. The folders grew, and with them, my obsession. I began to make appointments. In red, the names of the victims. In blue, the doctors responsible. In black, the American officials who knew. In grey, those who covered it up. And in white, I left spaces for those who had yet to be discovered. I investigated like crazy. I read old telegrams, read newspapers interlined, read internal OSS reports that were never officially released. I discovered connections between Nazi scientists and American universities. I saw names changed, identities renamed, histories erased. Yes, they rewrote the monsters' biographies. And more, they shaped the future with their blood-stained hands. I wondered, at what point does a man stop being an executioner and become an expert? At what point does the world decide that utility is worth more than justice? Because I saw it happen before my eyes. The same doctor who had signed off on the deaths of hundreds was now publishing scientific papers. The same engineer who had designed torture chambers was now working at NASA. The same woman who sterilized girls with chemicals was now running a fertility lab in the United States. And no one said anything. The world spun. Time passed. The wounds. Not those. They were scarred. They were buried alive. But I refused to let everything die with silence. I began to write what I called the minutes of the invisible trial. Each page was a dossier. Each chapter, a scream. And the verdict was clear. Guilty. All of them. Not by the pity of men, but by the justice of memory. One night, I almost got caught. A colleague came into the room while I was organizing one of the folders. He said he had forgotten a diary. I pretended not to. I told him about a report I needed to review. I smiled with the kind of smile you learn to make when you live in the shadows. But inside, I trembled. Because I knew, if they found out what I was doing, they would destroy me. They would call me crazy, a conspirator, disturbed. And maybe I was really becoming disturbed. I began to sleep surrounded by papers. I started to lock the drawers with improvised padlocks. I distrusted everything, even mirrors. One morning, after a sleepless night, I looked at myself and barely recognized myself. Deep circles under my eyes, yellowish skin, a beard grown, a fixed gaze. But my eyes burned with the fever of someone who still refuses to let the world forget. I had become a historian of horrors, someone who lives among the ruins of truth. And yet, even so, I continued. Because that justice that had been torn from my hands in the official court, I was rebuilding there, in silence, with my own hands. Paper by paper, name by name, death by death, until one day, someone finally listens. Invisible threats, hide or reveal. I started locking all the doors, even when I was alone. Especially when I was alone. Fear was no longer a distant shadow. It was a constant presence. Dense. As if it had a shape. Weight. As if it was sitting in the chair next to me while I wrote. I started talking less to people. Even to the few colleagues I still had left. Their questions seemed too dangerous to me. Any gesture could be a disguise. Any silence could hide eyes. Sometimes, I was sure I was being followed. A figure crossing the street. A car parked too close to my window. A phone that would beep out of nowhere. But I no longer even trusted my own sanity. I was sleeping badly. Eating little. The tension was disintegrating me, cell by cell. And in the midst of all this, the file grew. More folders. More sheets. More tests. It was as if, by keeping the truth, I was building my own coffin. I knew that this material could never fall into the wrong hands. If they found it, they could arrest me, silence me, or worse. But if I destroyed it all, it was like killing all over again everyone who had already died. I found myself faced with a dilemma: hide it, or reveal it. What if I died suddenly? An accident, a heart attack, an unexpected visit. What would happen to my work? What I had discovered? What about the truth that no one else wanted to keep? It was at this point that I began to think about running away. Not running away from the country. That wasn't what this was about. It was a run from the darkness. An attempt to ensure that if I was erased, at least the story would survive. I began to make copies of everything. I wrote a handwritten index, with cross-references and code names for the people involved. I created a navigation notebook, as I called it. A secret guide for whoever might one day find that file. I hid the copies in unlikely places. Inside poetry books, in fake medicine boxes, behind old paintings in the basement of an antique shop that never received customers. In one of them, I wrote by hand, "If you are reading this, history can still be saved." The nights became a parade of paranoia. I dreamed of knocks on the door, of eyes watching me through the cracks, of gloved hands rummaging through my drawers. One morning, I woke up to a crack coming from the kitchen. I grabbed a knife. I walked barefoot down the dark hallway. There was no one there, but the feeling that someone had been there permeated the air. Little by little, I realized I was turning into a shadow of what I was chasing. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper. It was the certainty that I would not come out of this hole. That my mind, already fragmented, would never be what it was again. But there was something stronger than fear. Duty. Because I knew what happened to history when it was left in the wrong hands. They shaped it. They polished it. They turned monsters into scientists, torturers into consultants. And no one remembered the girls screaming in cold rooms, the nameless men piled up behind hidden clinics, the children who cried and never came back. I started writing letters. One to a French journalist I had met during the first trials, another to a survivor who lived in Hungary, a third to an Argentine historian obsessed with lost archives. It didn't explain everything. I left clues, places, dates, fragments, the hope that one day someone would put the puzzle together. I even thought about burying part of the file. I had a map, a remote place, to the north, an abandoned warehouse that belonged to the grandfather of a childhood friend. Maybe it was safe, maybe not. What kept me awake at night was the doubt. What if everything was erased again? Not by destruction, but by disinterest. What if, when they revealed what I had kept, the world simply didn't care? This idea haunted me more than any physical threat, because there is something worse than forced oblivion. It is chosen oblivion. One day, I sat at the table and stared at all the scattered folders. I thought about burning everything. Right there. Light matches one by one, and let the fire solve what justice could not. But I didn't have the courage. Because, deep down, I knew. If I gave up, they would win. Again. With silence, with conveniences, with promises of progress stained with blood. I closed my eyes. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I slept without locking the door. Because if they were going to take me, at least the truth was already in motion. The beginning of the end, when I decided to betray the silence. It was a cloudy morning, without birds and without sound. The kind of morning that seems suspended between two worlds, neither alive nor dead. Exactly how I felt inside. I had spent the night awake, with my eyes fixed on a single sheet of paper. One of the first. An old statement from 1945. The shaky handwriting of an elderly woman who had lost all her grandchildren in Ravensbrück. She did not ask for revenge. She only asked, "May it not be in vain." Those 4 words hammered inside me like a sentence. I knew the time had come. Either I acted, or I would become an accomplice to oblivion. And so, with cold fingers, I made the decision. That morning, I would betray the silence. I prepared a folder with only part of the archive. I chose the most indisputable documents, signed medical reports, photographs of experiments, letters exchanged between American officers and Nazi scientists with proposals for technical collaboration. It was not everything, but it was enough to start an earthquake. I took a tram to the central station. In my backpack, the folder stuck to my back seemed to weigh like lead. At each stop, I looked around, waiting, suspicious. The destination was clear, the offices of a small investigative newspaper in Frankfurt. It wasn't famous. but its editor-in-chief, a man named Emil Gersten, had been expelled from the army for exposing abuses in prison camps. He was the last hope I knew. I arrived at 11:42 a.m. The building was old. No signs. No doorbell. I knocked on the wooden door 3 times. And waited. A few minutes later, a woman answered. She looked at me as if she already knew who I was. "Are you the one from the archive?" I nodded. She didn't say anything else. She motioned for me to come in. The hallway smelled of old paper and cold coffee. We went down 2 flights of stairs to a basement. There, among piles of yellowed newspapers and boxes of audio tapes, he was Emil. Aged, thin, with sunken eyes, but attentive. "You came," he said, as if he doubted himself. I opened my backpack. I placed the folder on the metal table. He didn't touch it right away. He just stared at me for a moment too long. "Do you have any idea what this could cause?" "I do," I replied, "but I'm more afraid of what will happen if I keep quiet." He opened the folder. He began to leaf through it. And as he read, the color drained from his face. At one point he stopped at a letter. It was an internal memorandum, in English, dated 1946, with the postmark of the US Air Force. The document authorized the secret integration of 3 doctors and 2 engineers from the previous regime into American research programs. One of them was Hans Eppinger, the same one who had tested salt water on thirsty prisoners. "They knew," Emil whispered. "They knew, from the beginning." He looked at me, but now, there was something different in his eyes. Anger. Not blind, vengeful anger, but the kind of anger that comes from facing the truth too raw to digest. "Do you have any more of this?" "Yes," I said. "A lot more." "Will you give me all of it?" "Not yet. I need to know I can trust you." He nodded. We made a deal right then and there. I would hand over the rest in bits, little by little. And he, in exchange, would start a parallel investigation. Quiet, nameless, uncredited. But before he left, he told me, "If this comes to light, you will be hunted. Not by criminals, but by governments." I already knew that. And yet, I left that newsroom feeling lighter. For the first time in years, the weight seemed shared. I was no longer alone. But the feeling of relief was short-lived. That same night, someone tried to break down my door. They couldn't. But they let me. Marks. Scratches on the lock. Footprints on the porch. And a folded newspaper sheet. With a cross drawn in pen. There was no signature. There were no words. But the message was clear. Someone knew. I ran to my secondary hiding place. I checked the boxes. They were intact. But at that moment, I knew. The countdown had begun. Now, there was no turning back. I had removed the first stone from the wall. And I knew that sooner or later someone would come and bury me under the rubble. But if I fell, at least I would go down fighting. And the truth had already begun to slip through the cracks. The siege, when the truth begins to bleed. I knew something had changed when I saw someone's reflection behind me, in the tram's mirror. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't delirium. It was real. A man in a dark overcoat, a tilted hat, his face hidden. He didn't look directly at me, but he was always 2 seats away, for the past 3 days. And it wasn't just him. At the stationery store where I always bought my notebooks, the clerk didn't greet me. The street where I lived suddenly had a car parked with mud-covered license plates. And for 3 nights in a row, my phone rang at exactly 3:17 a.m. When I answered, there was absolute silence. No breathing. No noise. No voice. Just the echo of my own existence hanging on the wire. That's when I realized. They were hunting me. Who? I'm not sure. Maybe American intelligence. Maybe infiltrated remnants of the old regime. Maybe both, or something bigger. But it didn't matter. What mattered was what I carried, and the time I still had left to protect it. I ran to one of my hiding places. I checked everything. Boxes intact, documents in place, envelopes numbered as I had left them. But something bothered me. A feeling, perhaps a primitive instinct, as if someone had already been there, and simply put everything back. I dropped a strand of hair between two sheets of the main folder. I closed it. I waited until the next day. When I opened it, the strand was no longer there, and it was at that moment, exactly at that second, that I understood. I was being watched even in my memories. I could no longer go home. I could no longer trust any path that I myself knew. I started sleeping in different guest houses. Every night in a different bed. Every breakfast among strangers, pretending to be a tourist, an immigrant, anything, except myself. My beard grew. My face fell. My gaze was lost. But what I never left behind were the copies. They came with me, hidden, sewn inside the lining of an old bag, divided into envelopes, mixed in with warm clothes and torn books. Every time I passed a police checkpoint or was stared at by a stranger on the train, I felt that moment would be the last. That someone would find out. And it would all end there. But they kept coming. The threats. A note stuck under the doorknob of a hotel room. Nobody reads dead bodies. An envelope left on the station bench, with newspaper clippings and a single underlined sentence. He died of natural causes. Natural causes. Of course. Just like so many others who dared to speak out before me. By this time, Emil, the journalist, had already published the first fragment of the material. A short story. Discreet. Under a pseudonym. He was talking about scientists with Nazi histories working on American soil. He didn't name names directly, but it was enough to trigger a reaction. Major newspapers ridiculed it. They called it conspiracy theories, pathological revisionism, loser fantasies. But then the phone calls started. Anonymous letters. And one night, a brick came through the newsroom window. Inside, it was just a folded piece of paper. Stop. Emil wrote to me by hand. He said he was thinking about leaving the country. He said his wife had started receiving threatening phone calls. He said someone had followed his daughter home from school. And then he asked, "Are you sure it's worth it?" That question haunted me for days. Because, deep down, I was no longer sure of anything. Not even if the world really wanted to know the truth. Not even if revealing it would make a difference. Not even if, by giving it all away, I wouldn't just be signing my own death warrant. But one night, sitting alone in a forgotten boarding house in southern Germany, I opened one of the oldest folders. Inside, I found a photograph. Black and white. Blurred. But clear enough. It was the face of a boy. Blindfolded. Tied to a stretcher. A number scrawled on his arm. And below it, the signature of a doctor who now held a prominent position in a European hospital. And on the back of the photo, handwritten, in Polish, "If anyone sees this, don't shut up." I cried. Not like before. This time, it was a silent cry. With no tears, but with my soul tearing apart inside. The kind of pain that comes not because of what they did, but because of everything that they let it continue to be done. And that was the moment I decided. I would not run away anymore. I would not hide anymore. If they were ready to bury me, then let them bury me. But not before they heard my voice. Not before I released the monsters from the basement, and wrote down their names. The last act, if I disappear, promise me you will remember. I always imagined that the end would come with violence. With sirens. With broken doors. With screams, blood or a clean shot in the dark. But no. The end came silently, in the form of a choice. An envelope. And a single moment of courage that, to this day, I still have trouble explaining. It was a moonless dawn. The streets were empty, plunged into a damp darkness, as if the city itself had stopped breathing. I had spent the last few days hiding in an abandoned house on the outskirts of Leipzig. I ate canned food. I slept little. And I rewrote, one last time, everything I knew. It was like preparing my tombstone. I put together the package with the final copies. Photos, reports, names, a complete index with the connections between Nazi doctors and American, European, and even Brazilian and Argentine laboratories. On the cover, I wrote in red pen, "For whoever still wants to see." And, just below, another sentence, the only one that seemed fair to me, after all. They killed the truth, but they couldn't bury it whole. I knew I couldn't trust regular mail. I knew I couldn't use my name. So I became a different man. I forged documents. I used a pseudonym stolen from one of the doctors who had helped me escape in 1946. A small act of irony. I let him be the bearer of his own denunciation. I went to Hamburg, on a night train. I traveled with the briefcase on my lap, as if it were my son, or my soul. Each station was a warning. Each door opening, a sentence. But no one stopped me. I arrived at my destination at 4:02 a.m. The offices of one of the oldest newspapers in the country. I didn't choose it by chance. They had been accomplices during the war. Now, I would force them to clean up part of their own guilt. I left the package inside a metal box at the back, used for internal correspondence. Enclosed, an anonymous letter. You were silent in the past. Now, the world is listening. If you choose to be silent again, you will carry this death in your hands too. I walked back, without looking back. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on a park bench, with my coat pulled tight around my neck, and just waited for the world to react. The sky cleared, and the sound of the city coming back to life seemed like a mockery to me. As if everything could go on. Even after knowing. Even after seeing. But something inside me told me that the seed had been planted. And seeds don't go back. 2 weeks later, the article came out. The cover. Grainy photos, blurry documents, names that were hard to pronounce. But they were there. All of them. For the first time, the truth was on the newsstands. And with it, came the hurricane. Interviews. Denial. Official silence. Diplomats refusing to comment. Institutions claiming they didn't know. Old men in hospitals, now fearing losing their titles. Governments trying to control what could no longer be contained. But I could no longer be present. Because in this game, exposure has a price. 3 days after the publication, Emil disappeared. Without a trace. The editorial office was set on fire. The physical files disappeared. The copies were left, circulating in invisible hands. Digitized, distributed on public machines, sent as spam to thousands of addresses. It was like trying to kill a plague. But that plague was the truth. And the truth, once released, does not return to its cage. I went on my way. I turned into smoke. I rented fake names, temporary jobs, one-room houses. The only real thing I carried with me was you. You who are listening to my voice now. You, who came this far. Who followed every fragment of this story, even when it began to hurt. Even when it started to seem too absurd to be real. You are all I have left. Because I don't know how much time I have left. Maybe, when this video ends, I will have already ceased to exist. But my story, our story, cannot die with me. So, I ask you, if something here touched you, if something made your chest tighten, if some voice whispered in you the same thing it whispered in me, don't be silent. Don't let the truth be erased. Don't let the world keep spinning as if nothing had happened. Spread it. Share it. Investigate it on your own. Distrust what people tell you. Reread the names. Recognize the faces. And above all, if I disappear, promise me that you will remember.